Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the last Open for Discussion series. My name is Saskia van Stein. I'm a curator, I'm an educator, and a member of the Curatorial Research Collective, and I'll be moderating today's event. The CRC is part of the Department of the Built Environment at Eindhoven University of Technology. And we, as a group, consider ourselves an interdisciplinary research and design entity that critically engages with the theory and the practice of architecture culture, its discourse, and also its broader societal frameworks. Now, for our Open for Discussion series, we organized these events to further and even to some extent maybe address a conversation that we recognize as being a persistent problem that architecture has when it comes to diversity and representation. We have structured these talks around inequality and lack of inclusion around three major domains: architecture education, the architecture practice, and the built environment. And since it's the last talk, I want to maybe very roughly outline what we've been talking about to ensure, enable, and possibly even empower towards a more diverse and inclusive understanding of the architectural culture, specifically addressing new methods and strategies to learn or possibly even unlearn. We spoke about othering, for some a tool of empowerment, for some perceived as exclusion. We talked about systemic racism. This was mainly the point that Adam Betsky also brought in, how language actually translates into our curricula. He also talked about legislation and the monetary reality of the educational system, but I would say that goes for the discipline at large. We talked about underrepresentation on queerness, race, class, and diversity. We spoke about Dutch, super Dutch, and possibly the transition towards super diversity. So what does that say about authorship? And yesterday we had our closing, that was on Tuesday, we had our closing session on Amsterdam Zuidoost, the Bijlmer, that somehow tried to understand the idea of good intentions and cultural appropriation and how they differ, and to what extent one has to maybe shift an architectural position in order to work with the situated knowledge of the communities at large. I can't possibly combine in a few words everything that was said, but there is definitely an awareness rising when it comes to the questions related to identity and architecture. And the main question we are left with is, how can we find or use this attention, in fact, to transition to notions of action? And I'm hoping to unpack that a little further today. Because today we will be talking and drawing conclusions from the annual report on spatial architectural design as a sector. And this is performed by three scholars, from the University of Amsterdam. And the whole report was launched on Monday. So we're very happy to have them on board and be so closely, let's say, topical on the matter. And we've invited Floris Alkemade, our Chief Government Architect, to respond, whom I'll introduce in a second. But to give a basic outline on the report, I will introduce two of the three scholars that have worked on it. First of all, that's Robert C. Kloosterman. He's a professor of economic geography and planning at the University of Amsterdam. His research focuses on urban economies, and in particular the role of migrant entrepreneurship and the creative industries and how that plays out into the architectural discipline. He's also the lead partner in Cicerone, I hope I pronounced that correctly, I gave it an Italian twist, which is an international research project on cultural and creative industries funded by the EU under Horizon 2020. He's also a visiting professor on many universities, for instance, in Birmingham and Milano. Together with Suzan van Kempen, he worked on this, and Romy Malo. The introduction of Suzan is that she's a research master at the Urban Studies program at the University of Amsterdam, and her master thesis, she researches how women actually sense the sense of safety in the public realm. And for this, she has used different case studies, both in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. She's also a junior researcher at Cicerone, and that is the same project that I introduced already. So I think without further ado, it's maybe good to mention that this was commissioned, this annual report was commissioned by the Atelier Rijksbouwmeester and other partners, but let's first get down to what the findings were. I don't know if I give the word to Suzan or Robert, but the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm gonna share my screen. Can you all see it?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So thank you, Saskia, for your introduction, and thank you for having us too. So my name is Suzan, and I work for the Cicerone project as a junior researcher. So this is a large Horizon 2020 project that investigates cultural and creative industries together with 8 other European partner universities. And we, as the UvA team, has been assigned to the architectural sector as well. And that's sort of how we got in touch with Atelier Rijksbouwmeester. So for this project, the jaarrapportage, or the annual report, we got access to the data of Central Bureau for Statistics and the Architects Register. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background to the story of how this report really came about. So we had 2 different data sets, and we could interlink and intertwine all these different characteristics and topics and subjects, and that's how we got an image, like only a quantitative image of what the sector really looks like. So these 2 different approaches were one through the Architect Register and one through CBS, which works with SBI codes, which are codes that you get assigned that are about your economic activity. So the fact that we had these 2 approaches really worked in our favor on the one hand, because you could see, sometimes the spatial design or the design sector is way more elaborate than only the Architect Register. But on the other hand, it was really hard to, what is to really define and demarcate the sector. So this is a bit of a background. We have to say that our project or our report didn't only focus on diversity and inclusivity and representation, but we did find some interesting data and results that are very relevant to this discussion. So firstly, the male-female distribution per discipline. So in the Architect Register, they distinguish 4 disciplines. I tried to translate it in English, but so then I would say landscape architects, urban architects, interior architects, and the group of what we call today regular architects, because it's the most common idea for an architect, I would say. So when we look at the male-female distribution, it becomes clear that this sector is very male-dominated, especially within the architects. The interior architectural sector is the only discipline in which women are overrepresented by somewhat, I would say 5%. And also when you look at the right figure, we do witness a possible trend break. You can see that in the cohort of 23 to 34, it's the first cohort where there's actually more women than men that are registered in the Architect Register. And then when we look at male-female distribution by earnings, by monthly salary, it is very, very obvious that the high incomes are generated only or mostly by men working in the sector, whereas the low incomes are divided more equally. So that could mean men are overrepresented in the high income groups, or women are underrepresented, or both. This could also have to do with the weekly working hours. It becomes clear that even in the discipline of interior architects, which is this with these codes 71112 and 74103, that is interior architects. Even in this one, the only discipline in which women are overrepresented, more men work full-time than women do. So it is interesting to see that this pattern really appears every time we make these sort of linkages. We recognize these patterns of inequality, or at least quite distinct profiles when it comes to male-female working in the architectural sector. Yeah, so we decided not to give you too many figures, but here you have an idea of what we researched, and there's a more elaborate explanation, of course, in the whole report. I will now give the word to Robert, who will elaborate on some of our insights. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Suzan. Yeah, well, Suzan has showed that there's a clear pattern of distinct profiles, and you could say it's partly a legacy of earlier times, especially if you look at the, if you remember the graph that Suzan showed, where we looked at the age cohorts, especially among the older age cohorts, the share of men is much higher than that of women. And it seems to me, we haven't looked at that yet, but it seems to me that especially what the general architects, you know, the more the largest category that has a quite extreme distribution between men and women, both in terms of shares who are working there, but also in terms of earnings. And although it's a legacy of earlier times, I think there's no doubt about that. It may still be the case. That's what I think, what I assume is still the case, that the mechanisms of reproduction are still in place. And it has to do, of course, with the organizational work across time. So not just on a daily basis, but also on a weekly basis, and very much so on a career time scale. You know, when women, many women tend to leave paid work, or at least full-time paid work, when they have children. So, and I guess that's also happening in the architectural sector. So that also means that the organizational work, if you want to create a more equal distribution across gender lines, then you should certainly look at that. Well, that of course nothing new under the sun, but it also has to do with the social networks. That's always crucial in any kind of setting. People tend to give jobs to people who resemble themselves, and that also means that social networks, in this case now it's the proverbial all boys networks, I guess, which are crucial in giving jobs to other people. So you also have to look at the social networks within the architectural sector, and that will take time, of course. But still, maybe you can find, or it might make sense. I will say a bit more about that in a second. But it might make sense to speed up the process in this. And then what I assume, but I'm not sure, we haven't done research on that. But we did a case study on architectural design in Rotterdam. It's still, you know, we still have to send it to a journal, so I can't say that much about it. But when we looked at how the production network of this particular project came into being, there were only men and they were all enthusiastic. But what we also noticed was that they spoke a shared vocabulary. It was very much men in construction talking to other men in construction. So if you look at the architectural sector and you wanted to make it more equal, it does of course make sense to look at the architectural itself. But maybe you should also have a look at who is sitting at the other side of the table, who is crucial in the assignments, in the commissioning of architectural projects. So it will also make sense to have a look at that. I'm not sure what that's very anecdotal. I do think that the number or the share of women in the construction industry is increasing as a whole. that also has to do with all kinds of processes, not just with emancipation, but also with the fact that to an ever lesser extent, let's say physical power is important in the construction industry. So I do think that the construction industry is becoming less masculine, but still I think you should also have a look at that. So not just look at the architectural sector as a whole, but also have a much broader contextual approach to see what's happening there. And you could say that this is an issue which is of course important for women who want to make a career in the architectural sector. That's absolutely true. But architectural design is one of the few cultural and creative industries which is almost, it's completely inescapable for citizens. It's always out there. The built environment is inescapable. And we're talking about the need for a more inclusive, a greener kind of built environment that also implies a more diverse composition of the construction industry, not just the architectural sector, but also a broader view on that as well. People can then come up with a much broader, a richer idea of what is at stake, identifying what the problems are, also coming up with new sets of solutions, combinations of solutions. So I think the need for a more equal gender distribution transcends the sector by far. And we in Amsterdam, we at the University of Amsterdam, this is very much a topic which is much discussed. And I can say that in our department, there are now more female full professors than male full professors, and also people from not just from the Netherlands, but also from abroad. And that really has boosted also the scope of things that people are looking at, and also has stimulated not always, but in many cases also a very fruitful discussion. So I think that this is an important issue that goes beyond the architectural sector itself.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks for the two of you putting all of that in perspective. Maybe if we stop sharing the screen. Yeah, super. So there's the gender issue, there's the time issue, the monetary issue, and then also you introduce the idea of look at this not only through the lens of the discipline, but also in which context this discipline is rooted. I'll be sure to come back to you on some questions related to that, but I think without further ado, I'd like to ask Floris Alkemade to respond. Now, it seems to me he needs little to no introduction, but nevertheless I will. I've already mentioned that he's a chief, unfortunately parting, but still chief government architect until September 1st. And he's also as such chairman of the board of government advisors, and within his capacity as advisor, advising on any scale related from the interior to real estate to refurbishments. Besides his job as chief government architect, he also works on his own firm, FAA, in which he combines research with different scales and levels of architecture, anything to do from architecture to urban development, both in Europe and beyond. He has also been involved as curator with the Architecture Biennial Rotterdam, and he has a lectureship at the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam. And I think one of the things that he's been extremely successful in his unfortunately said ending of tenure as chief architect is actually to stimulate the architectural discourse and urban development, and really push for societal values and how they resonate to the quality of the discourse, but of course also of the quality of the architectural environment per se. So without further ado, Floris, maybe I may ask your initial responses to the report as put forward by the University of Amsterdam.
Yeah, thank you, Saskia. I surely will do that. And I think the report already has been elaborated by Suzan and by Robert in a very precise way. And the report is in a way very shocking, of course. In the Netherlands, we always assume that we are doing the right thing and that somehow our society is doing justice to the men, women, gender questions. But at the same time, when you really measure it, you find what the real situation is. And of course, the question beyond this, how does this happen? I thought one of these graphs are very promising in a way that it looks like the youngest generation of architects is getting a better balance now. So maybe it is progressing, but in order to be sure about that, it's very important that these kind of measurements are done repeatedly. So this is the second one, and the more you repeat them, the better you will be able to tell what you really learn from it. Important to realize that in the Netherlands, we are also in Europe, the country where most women are working part-time, which is also part of what we see here. But I think apart from all these numbers, from all these givens, there's another thing what we see happening that is after the economic crisis we faced some years ago. A lot of people, a lot of architects lost their job. And so we're not back at the former level. And that also means something. It means that our profession as such needs to redefine what its relevance is. And of course, we're all trained as architects, as designers, to deal with aesthetics, to deal with commissions, to deal with clients, to deal with budgets, to deal with planning. And I have to say the Dutch architects are really good at it. It's amazing how well our profession in the Netherlands has been evolved, and it's worldwide recognition of its quality. But I dare to say that this focus on the aesthetics, no matter how important it is, it's only half of the profession. I think the other half of what the profession is about the ethics of the profession. So what morality do you live by? And I think that's what we learn both from the economic crisis and from also the COVID crisis. Is okay, but there is a different story to it, which has to do with social qualities, with solidarity, with a lot of things that has to do also with the public domain. And I think we're able to predict the future now, for first time in the world history maybe. And because if you look at what happened the past 30 years, what we witnessed is a revolution. It's a revolution on the technology side. The way we developed our computers, our software, our virtual worlds, the way we all live on the internet now. It's amazing what happened there, how fast it was. Our iPhones, they're only, I think now 12 or 13 years old, and it changed our lives profoundly. That's what happened the past 30 years. Amazing, strong. But what we forgot to look at is the real world in real time. And we see the world suffering now. And we see it on every possible field. There is a climate change, biodiversity is declining. We need an energy transition. We need to come up with a sustainable food production. We have to build 1 million houses in the Netherlands. And all these questions are spatial questions. And all these questions, therefore, are also design issues. And I think this is where our profession is heading to. And this is also why it's so important to be a totally inclusive profession. Because first of all, I think to address all these big questions on the local scale, we have to be aware of our blindness. What do we not see? And if we look at the world, we always see it from our own perspective. And it's so important to collaborate with other insights, to embed them. And I think this is what designers can do. Designers are specialists in change. And Of course, we have different forces working in our world. We have the politics. The politics are bound to election rhythm, which is only 4 years. And in 4 years' time to have promises and to deliver them is impossible if you look at the nature of the questions we're facing. We have a second big force, the market force, but they have to work with return on investment. And there is 1 year, maybe 2 years, the max. So we see a transformative change that we need to kickstart, and that nor the politics nor the market forces are ready to deal with it. And I think that's where the relevance of designers comes. They are able to have a very complex situation and to make sense out of it, to think long term, to think spatially. And that's why I think we are facing a very interesting time. The fact that what used to be idealistic thinking, what used to be utopian thinking, soon will be the only, if not the most plausible way forward. And I'll give you one example. There is an official policy from Europe and our own government to reduce CO2 emissions by 2030 with 55%. So we have 9 years to reduce CO2 emissions 55%. That's enormous as a task. Our buildings and our building production together, they represent 37% of all the CO2 emissions. So there's no way that our buildings and our building production will escape from the coming rapid revolution. And nor the politics nor the markets are prepared. And I think designers are capable of doing that. And but as I said, it begins with an awareness of blindness, awareness of how important it is to be inclusive. And it has to do with the gender situation, but it also has to do with that it not should be only the white privileged people working on these issues. And I think that's what we are facing. And as I said, it's interesting to see now that this becomes more and more visible. One of the promising things, I think, is the agenda that also from the European Union is now being erected with the new European Bauhaus. Ursula von der Leyen initiated it. And she said, well, the fact that we are facing so many big changes simultaneously demands for a different way of thinking, planning, and designing. And so in that sense, I think everybody realizes we need to change. And we need to change profoundly. We need to change on many different strains simultaneously. And I think this is where the relevance of the designer community comes and steps forward. And in that sense, to be able to deal with this task, we need to know who we are, who we represent. And that is, I think, what this report is doing. And then so the big utopian thinking is combined with very rational looking at who are we. And I like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Floris. Just to sort of jump in straight away, Robert mentioned we have to prevent the idea of reproducing ourselves. Now, the last, let's say, big idea we had, of course, was modernity. And some of the people are critiquing the European Bauhaus ambition by the European Union for its lack of, let's say, specificity of the position of the architect. Mm. And I'm not saying this in a cynical manner, but how do you see it that we can prevent, with the scale of the question that is out there? You mentioned a few already, the climate, but also just on a very sort of practical level, the million houses. How, to your understanding, do we prevent that the good intentions that we are driven by somehow are not the pitfalls of excluding others? Is there a sort of a tool or a strategy or a possible attitude, you mentioned ethics, that we should focus on?
Yeah, well, I think we should focus on the fact that this is a cultural question. As designers, we always imagine that we are the most important of all. But I think spatial planning, designing, it's not an aim, it's a means. And it's a means to achieve a society as we want it. And I think for the politics, it's very important that they not tell us how to do it. But I think politics, they should tell what we want. And politics should say, okay, this is the aim, this is what we want. But you are the designers, tell us how we can achieve that. And also I think it's very important that designers are not sitting back and waiting until somebody tells them, well, you're very relevant and please come and help us. I think we should build up our own storyline, our own relevance and step forward. And as I said, these are exciting times. It's a real revolution. And the only way forward, as I said, is make utopian the most realistic option. And bio-based building, as such, it's clear. There's no other way, and that will kickstart a new way of thinking about architecture, about being sustainable, being about circular, but also to have building typologies that are completely renewable, but also different building topologies dealing with a society where loneliness is one of the main topics at the moment.
Yeah. Maybe if I can return back to the report, a question I had while reading it, and this is something that we recognize also in our talks, that we know where the fundamental pain points are, yet how to use this momentum to actually indeed generate change. I was wondering, Suzan or Robert, how are you planning to push this forward? Or is it a combination with Atelier Rijksbouwmeester? Like, what could be a possible next step to create positive action related to your findings?
Well, this is a very, very, very cowardly argument, but we were asked to map it. And that's what we did. But I can come up with some personal views, and maybe Suzan wants to add to that. That given the complexity of the issue to create more diversity, and we haven't looked at that, but I guess this was also in the Yearbook of Architecture Design of 2021. There was also an article by, what's her name, Anna Markic?
Anna Markic.
Yeah, who also made a point that it's not just women are underrepresented, but also people from non-mainstream groups in the Netherlands. So I'll take that point on board as well. But it's a complex issue. So as I mentioned, it's not just one measure that will be able to solve the situation. So it's much more complex. You have also to, I think that Floris was already referring to that. It's also a matter of culture, but you have to look at the practices, the practice of recruiting people, how social networks are constituted. And I guess that if you look at the educational institutions in architectural design, that women are that probably is 50-50, or maybe even more girls than boys nowadays. So the supply also, so to speak, is out there, and now becomes the question how to be able to channel that supply into not just into the architectural design sector, but also eventually in key positions, and that as I mentioned, that will take time, but we need to speed up the process, and it's about. I think that first of all, that there has to be more awareness, and I think that this session that we have this evening is about that awareness, and I guess also that young women who are now, let's say, banging on the door of architectural design or who have just moved in, they won't take no for an answer now, if they want to move up. So that's also important. So they will also have much more voice, I guess, than let's say 10 years ago. Or maybe let alone longer ago. But as I mentioned, it's not just a matter of architectural design. It's a much broader issue. It will also be very important if women and people from non-mainstream groups in the Netherlands will also sit on the other side of the table where decisions are made, who who is going to design this bridge, school, sets of housing or whatever. So that's also very important. So in that sense, it has to the scope of policies has to be much broader than that. And the construction sector as a whole has to open up to other to these groups which have hitherto been mostly on the outside.
Yeah, yeah. For our guests, if you have a question, please pop a line in the Q&A and I will pose the question to our guests, also for the people following us on YouTube. Maybe, Suzan, maybe I can pose the question differently also. You have been looking into the sense of safety. It's a bit maybe beside the topic, but it did lead me to the question of which different, let's say, socio-spatial aspects that you have found in your research, which are important and fuel this conversation towards a more diverse and inclusive, yeah, I would nearly say, can we say feeling, or is it a material question or a digital question?
Yeah, no, that is definitely interesting. And my research was also very much about COVID and the pandemic and the influence on urban public space. And what I really found was that there were so many instances or examples that I'm very sure that no one really thought about before these women experienced their unsafety. For example, all the bars being closed outside or like on the streets, that really made a lot of women feel uncomfortable. And their decreased visibility or lighting, and you see this interplay between, you know, the spatial elements and the sense of safety. And I really figure that if there was some more coming together of these different fields, then you know, if there would be more women on the other side of the table who know this sense of unsafety, who know if you walk through a park at night, what they need there is a terrace or, you know, a little restaurant or some people there, or street lighting. And I think that really showed in my research that the ones that experience the sense of unsafety are usually not the ones being able to solve it, although they do feel this responsibility. So that's why we teach a lot of young women to sort of shrink their lives or to take a lot of precautionary measures to avoid places, to fake phone calls, to share live locations. Whereas it is a more, I think it's more of a structural, institutional issue that men and women don't really share the same rights to public space, or at least to feeling safe in public space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so sort of partially is a social construct, but partially is also a spatial configuration, as you're mentioning. It's maybe a bit of a jump back to you, Floris. So one of the things that I draw from reading the report is that you started rightly so by saying it's quite shocking. The figures, the amount of people that are underrepresented, people that have very small, let's say, self-employed contracts. So there's, I would say, quite a fragmentation in the field at the moment. And I was wondering how these reports, or which vehicles we would have to somehow voice that scale that you are introducing, a utopian grander narrative, in order to somehow, as a design community, come up with a proper response. Is that an institutional question, a political question, or how could we make a bit more of a whole out of those fragments?
Yeah. Of course, it first of all is a kind of cultural question of awareness, but I think it might also be down-to-earth organizational questions. I think we can learn also a lot from how it is evolving in other professions. If you, for instance, look at the professions like medicine, on the university medicine, it's girls only at the moment. It's amazing how rapidly an entire culture has changed. And why is that? Being inclusive there means how can we get male students interested in this study? It's a reversed question there. And so is it then maybe that in the medicine professions, you have a different work conditions? Maybe part-time working is easier, I don't know. I think we also have to be aware of the really pragmatic day-to-day issues people are facing simply to organize their life in combination with their profession, with their work. So we have to be very aware and maybe also look at different countries. I also worked in Scandinavia and Norway. The balance there is totally different. And why is it that in Norway there are so many women architects on a professional base? I think it's. I think we should also try to learn from these examples.
Yeah. Do you know the answer? Sorry to interrupt, but do you know the answer? Why are the conditions better?
I think so. If in Norway a woman is having a baby, she can have a 2-year leave, 2 years. Yeah. And with totally all expenses covered. But also the father can do that with the same condition. And it's a very basic, simple rule. And all of a sudden, instead of being in panic, how can I get my life organized if I have a child? All of a sudden you have options to choose from. Yeah. And options that not only face at the position of the women, but also put the father in a different potential position. I think it's also to look at these things. It's not only within the profession, it's also how is the combination work and life organized.
Yeah, one of the questions that came in deals actually with this binary of the man-woman discrepancy that the data in the report actually introduce. And the question is then, what about different racial or ethnic diversity? Did you look at the representation within the profession as well? Was it surveyed, is the question. So besides the dichotomy man-woman, was there also racial, ethnic diversity, or were these data lacking?
I guess the question for Suzan and me, or
sorry, yes, sorry.
No, we didn't have any data on that. No,
we only had the nationality, which was in the architect register, but it didn't tell us that much, and because of privacy reasons, the CPS data didn't give us access to any ethnic or nationality data, but we did include it in the for future research. It is definitely very relevant and important to research, also because we pinpointed how internships and expats and everyone, a lot of people work in the sector, but they aren't registered in the architect register. And within these people, we expect that there's a lot of different nationalities, and it would be really interesting to look at where those people come from and what the boundaries are really for entering the sector, or what they stumble upon really. Yeah, so that is definitely something that needs to be looked into.
But indeed, like you said, on privacy issues, because on the same time also people are advising the government to stop reporting from what ethnic background people are, because it's also backfiring. And of course you can investigate what nationality they have, but you have to also realize that judging people on their ethnic background is not necessarily a positive thing.
Yeah, that actually came out in the conversation yesterday, also very interestingly, that there's even, let's say, the third generation of people living in the Bijlmer somehow reference a Suriname, for instance, spatial setting that they never ever lived in. So they have a sort of interesting reverse psychology on that. I wanted to question a little bit the tools that we use in architecture. So because I now thought like no data, no visibility. So the diagramming, the modeling systems that we use, are those, in other words, should we also use, are those still sufficient when it comes to the tools that the architect has? Should we think differently about what the relationship is between how we design, how we try to understand a particular context and how that then sort of talks back to the profession. It's maybe a bit of a complex question, but I'm somehow trying to get behind how we design, of course, reproduces certain systems of how we live and how we then start to maybe adapt it to what we think is a cultural, more inclusive, introducing color or ornament or a different facade of sorts. But I'm looking at what tools do we have as architects, and which ones should we scrutinize also?
Now, I think if I can answer firstly, I think it's very important to implement other disciplines in our design teams. We, as from our atelier Rijksbouwmeester, we organize design competitions every year, where we force designers to collaborate with other professions. For instance, we had the Who Cares competition, which was about caregiving in our neighborhoods. And we forced design teams to have embedded in that team a caregiving person. Could be a doctor, could be a nurse, whatever. And it's amazing to see how different people start to design if somebody who actually knows how the business of caregiving works advises them from inside and not from outside. And the same we did with the other competition, Bread and Games, where we forced teams to have in that team a farmer. And it's such a nice thing to see what designers start to develop as a new knowledge if they have to convince a farmer what to do with his own ground. And I think that is very, very important, that designers do realize that they also are living in a bubble, and in order to deal with societal issues, you have to open up and not let people react from the outside, but have them embedded in your team and in your thinking.
But Floris, to pursue these other motives, you also need a shift in the context. There was this very good article on the op-ed pages of the NRC by Nienke Happel about the, I'm not sure how to translate it, the kiloknaller mentaliteit in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, we have a time-honored tradition to produce everything as cheap as possible. And she really criticized the imperative of market demands on architectural design. So I think that's really very important. That the context you can collaborate as an architect with whomever you want, and also have to have very lofty ideals with how built environment should be reorganized. But still, there also has to be a larger context in which you are able to play out these ideas and to realize them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I often refer to my background at OMA, the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, where we also realized that we could have great ideas, but if the clients were not living up to that, you would be totally helpless and powerless. And that actually was the moment when we erected AMO, the reversed universe of OMA. And AMO as a think tank what we would call at the office client education. And so we're saying, as a client comes to us with a demand, before jumping into the response modus, we would tell the client, okay, but before we start the design, we want to work with you, with AMO, to redefine the question. And that always was very rewarding, in the sense that we could tell the client, okay, but what you want, you are referring to old models. And with your ambition, and with your site, and with your budget, you could do this, this, and that. And then you could actually work on different levels of ambition. And I think that's also part of what designing is about storytelling and about convincing clients. Because as soon as the client has defined its mission, defined the site, the budget, and then if you want to change the conditions, you're too late. So try to be part of formulating the question. It's a creative thing as well. But,
and how let's say we're talking about awareness, but how aware do you find, it's an open question to all speakers, the umfeld, because Robert, you mentioned that the whole context should in fact change. And I'm sort of trying to build up the parameters in my head. For instance, Floris, you also emphasize to think about generational inclusivity, right? We tend to think about gender and race and sexuality maybe, but or even, of course, the biodiversity, but the gender gap, but then affordability as a question of inclusivity. And change comes slow, yet the speed we need to rise up to all these questions. Is there anything, like, where should we start? For instance, what would, if I make it very concrete related to this report, what could be a long-term horizon for the report? And how can we make sure that it doesn't remain on the shelves and somehow made productive again to implement change?
Yeah, but these issues are related. On the one hand, to change the composition of the people working in the architectural sector, and on the other hand, a shift in the spatial policies, and so that's nested. So not just the spatial policies on the EU or national level, but also more focused on a micro scale, buildings, offices, those kind of things. So, and they are related, and I think that the climate crisis and now the pandemic has forced people to criticize let's say the very deeply ingrained modernist approach of one cause and one effect, and forget about second or let alone third order effects. So it's very much an efficiency driven kind of analysis which minimizes costs and maximizes profits in a very narrow sense. And I think that perspective is now being rapidly eroded. So I think that there's a chance, a window of opportunity to think in a much more broader way. But of course, you need also it's also a matter of politics and also trying to create coalitions along these themes. Also interesting, by the way, which because many people think that that combating climate crisis is something for Greta Thunberg, who I admire. So don't get me wrong, but let's say these kind of people. But I recently read that the insurance companies also want to combat climate crisis, because they will be deeply in trouble if climate change continues at this pace, because they will lose a lot of money. So there's also within let's say the world of capitalism, there are also forces, not just in terms of that they have motives of that they want to preserve the world for, but they also want to preserve their profits and their wealth. So so in that sense, I think you should think about creating all kinds of coalitions for this higher goal of improving the world and even saving the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what I meant when I say soon the utopian way will be the only way. And it simply has to do with economics as well. And indeed, the big investment companies are judging companies now. Okay, how does your balance look like if you have to be CO2 neutral? What does it mean for your company? Because they see the change coming, and indeed they have to look forward. Because a lot of people, companies who are in a money-driven society, they say, well, we have to be realistic about our budget. But they mean we have to be realistic within a time frame of 2 or 3 years. That's where the spreadsheet stops. But as soon as you have a spreadsheet that works over 10 or 20 years, then you have a totally different outcome. And that is what's happening now. And that is what these big investment companies are looking at. So change can also be faster.
Yeah, but so I would say that the things we are talking about are very mainstream in my reality as an educator, in this case at the Design Academy. We also see this discourse being put forward as cultural strategies in our archives, how we curate in exhibitions, and giving voices to what we used to then call minor voices. So I see these changes starting to happen, and I was wondering, Floris, if it's something that you also see on a sort of more political, or you now mentioned business has changed. Do you feel that what could be a vehicle or tool to generate awareness or is that awareness already there?
I think the awareness is there, but not in a way that it immediately will lead to different politics. For instance, now the national politics are obsessed by 1 million homes. So this is, and I talked to the people at the ministry high in the organization, and they told me, "Oh, sorry, Floris, but we have to build homes. No time for sustainability goals." As if this can be separated from one another. So these departments are so segregated from their agendas. That's a real worry. And again, this is where designers have to raise their voice and tell them there is an alternative to this.
Yeah, yeah. But
if I may, but
go ahead.
Architects are usually also there's a performative aspect to the architectural profession, and I think that so in that sense, someone like Le Corbusier, but maybe he was looking in the wrong direction, but that's another matter. But you can see that architects also they give voice to these utopian ideas, and in that sense, there is also a distinct role for architects because they will be able to show what they were able to paint even in a digital 3D way or whichever way to show what a utopian or a built environment or more particular urban environment might look like.
Yeah. So literally visualizing these alternatives.
Absolutely, yeah, giving voice to that, and also and in that sense, it's good that there is still a very strong professional identity among architects, and if you could tweak that identity a bit more in the direction that Floris wants them to, then they would also be able to give voice to that project, to that larger project, and say we shouldn't be doing this, but look at if you do this, then it could look like that, and also embedded in a much broader ecological, social kind of narrative.
I hope that resonates with the architectural field because it's a cry from the heart as well. But maybe to finalize the question is now that this report is offered to the Architect Registration Bureau. How can this independent advisory administrative body bring this question further? How can we give, what would be the proposition to them?
Well, I would say study it carefully, try to analyze it, and as I said, be sure to repeat this analysis I think it's every 2 years now. But also act, indeed. If you have real findings, act, make sure you put it on the agenda, make the part of the awareness, and join forces with other institutions to see how can we improve on this field. And maybe also to say, well, this might be important, we don't understand it yet, to do further investigations. In order to change something, you need to be aware of what it really is. And that is what this report is trying to do.
Yeah. Even very concretely, you take interior architects and landscape architects much more seriously than people have been doing, I guess. There's also a status hierarchy. And within the architectural profession, which is not coincidentally related also to the gender distribution, by the way. So I think you should also, especially the guys who won the Pritzker Prize, who were into refurbishment. I forgot that these two French guys, Floris. So I think that's also a sign of the times that there is now more. It's not just build a tower of 300 meters, but there's also a sense of that architecture should also be aware of should focus on different aspects, and that's also where interior architects and landscape architects can play a highly significant role.
Yeah, even though one could state that COVID has made very apparent that even our interior, the role of our interior has changed.
Sure.
I would state. But I'm very sorry to say, but we've maxed out our time together.
Okay.
A lot of very interesting propositions, especially the correlation that you hinted on at the end, Robert. I thank you very much, Suzan van Kempen and Robert Kloosterman and Floris Alkemade for joining us. For those of you who want to revisit one of the earlier talks, please, they can be viewed on the YouTube channel of Casa Vertigo, for whom we also thank their support and collaborative effort on these talks. We also want to acknowledge all the other institutions and people that are involved in catalyzing and further the topic of diversity and inclusion in the Netherlands and beyond. And on behalf of the whole group of CRC, thank you so much. We'll keep on pushing further with this envelope and bring it to the world, hopefully during Dutch Design Week in October. So stay tuned. Thank you for joining in and have a nice afternoon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao.